The moment Fannie Wilcox stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she told the very first lie of what she promised herself would be a brand new life, and it nearly ended everything before it could begin. The town of Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip, a rough and restless place where cattle drives churned the main street into a river of dust and boot heels, where saloon music spilled out of open doors even in the bright afternoon, and where strangers were regarded with a particular kind of squinting suspicion that came from years of hard living and harder lessons. Fannie knew none of this when she stepped down from the coach with a battered trunk, a reticule stitched from old curtain fabric, and a letter in her pocket that had been written by a woman she had never met. The letter was addressed to a Mr. Claude Hennessy, proprietor of the Hennessy Dry Goods and Feed, and it stated clearly that the bearer of the letter was a Miss Clara Beaumont of St. Louis, Missouri, experienced in bookkeeping and the management of general store accounts, and that she came highly recommended for a position of employment. Fannie was not Clara Beaumont. Clara Beaumont was her cousin, who had twisted her ankle stepping off a curb in St. Louis 3 days before the stage departed, and who had pressed the letter into Fannie's hands with the desperate logic of someone who had no other options. "You know numbers just as well as I do," Clara had said, wincing through the pain. "Better, honestly, you just go. You use my name and you get yourself settled and then you find something else. Claude Hennessy will never know the difference." Fannie had argued. She had argued the whole night through and most of the morning. But she was 22 years old. She had $17 to her name, and St. Louis had nothing left for her except the memory of a father who had drunk himself into his grave and a mother who had remarried a man with no patience for stepdaughters. She had taken the letter, taken the stage, and now here she was in Caldwell, Kansas, where the wind was already pulling strands of her dark auburn hair loose from their pins, and the sun was beating down on her like a personal accusation. She squared her shoulders, picked up her trunk, and walked toward the main street. Claude Hennessy turned out to be a round and jovial man of about 50, with a white beard and ink-stained fingers and the kind of permanent squint that came from decades of reviewing ledgers by poor candlelight. He welcomed her with genuine warmth, showed her to a small room in the back of the store that was clean and dry and smelled pleasantly of cedar, and told her she could start Monday morning. He called her Miss Beaumont without a flicker of doubt. And that was how Fannie Wilcox became Clara Beaumont in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, on the 21st day of April in the year 1879. She had been in town for exactly 4 hours when the trouble began. She had gone to fetch water from the well near the edge of the main street, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a bucket in her hand, when a commotion erupted from the direction of the livery stable. 2 cowboys were arguing loudly over the ownership of a dun-colored horse, and the argument had drawn a small crowd of onlookers who were more entertained than alarmed. Fannie watched for a moment from the edge of the crowd, curious despite herself. She had never seen a real cowboy argument before. St. Louis had its own roughness, but this was something different, something wider and louder and smelling of horse sweat and leather. She was so absorbed in watching the 2 men square off that she did not notice the man standing beside her until he spoke. "The gray-hatted one is lying," the man said quietly, with the tone of someone simply stating a fact. "That horse has got a brand from the Circular on its left hip, and Denny Alcott doesn't work the Circular, never has." Fannie turned. The man standing next to her was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the seams of his work shirt, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same limestone that jutted from the Kansas plains. He wore a weathered hat the color of old wheat, and had eyes the particular shade of gray-blue that reminded Fannie of thunderclouds rolling in from the west. He was not handsome in the smooth, easy way of the men she had known in St. Louis. He was something more than that, something assembled by hard weather and honest work into a kind of rough, useful beauty. He was also looking at the argument with the calm, assessing gaze of someone who had seen worse and expected to see it settled without too much additional fuss. "How can you tell from here?" Fannie asked because she genuinely wanted to know. He glanced at her sidelong. "I know horses," he said simply, "and I know brands." The argument resolved itself quickly enough. The owner of the livery stable came out and confirmed the Circular brand, and Denny Alcott, who was either a thief or an honest fool who had picked up the wrong horse, Fannie couldn't say which, was escorted away by a man with a badge on his vest. The crowd dispersed. The man beside her seemed to lose interest and turned as if to go. "I'm Clara Beaumont," Fannie said, because the words came out of her automatically, the way a newly learned reflex fires before the mind can catch up. He looked at her again, extended his hand. "Seth Ramsey," he said. "I ride for the Circular." She shook his hand. It was warm and calloused and entirely steady. "You've just come from a long drive," she said, noticing the dust on him that was different from the town dust, layered, traveled dust, the kind that settles into clothing over many miles of open country. Something in his expression shifted just slightly from polite neutrality to mild interest. "Came in yesterday evening," he said. "Just getting the horses sorted and then I'll be heading back out. Are you new to town? I don't recognize you." "I arrived today," she said. "I'm going to be keeping books for Mr. Hennessy at the dry goods store." "Claude's a good man," Seth said. "He'll treat you fairly." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell. "Welcome to Caldwell, Miss Beaumont. It's a rough town, but honest people mostly keep each other right." He walked away toward the livery stable, and Fannie watched him go with a feeling she couldn't quite name, something between admiration and a prickling unease, as if she had shaken hands with someone who was already, in some way she couldn't articulate, important. She went back to the well, filled her bucket, and tried to put him out of her mind. She did not succeed. The next morning she was behind the counter at Hennessy's Dry Goods, working through a stack of supply invoices that Claude had let pile up since February, when the bell above the door rang and Seth Ramsey walked in. He was cleaner than the day before, hat brushed, shirt fresh, and he moved through the crowded shelves of the store with the easy navigation of someone who knew the place well. "Morning, Claude," he said, and the two men shook hands and exchanged the brief, comfortable words of people who have done business together for years. Seth was buying supplies for the ride back to the Circular: salt pork, dried beans, coffee, a block of soap, and while Claude wrapped things up, Seth's eye drifted to Fannie behind the counter. "Miss Beaumont," he said with a nod of recognition. "Mr. Ramsey," she replied, and then, because she could not help it, "Did you get the Circular horse sorted out properly?" A small smile crossed his face, no more than a slight softening at the corners of his mouth, but it changed him considerably. "Returned to its rightful owner," he confirmed. "Denny Alcott claimed he found it loose on the road. Might even be true. He's not smart enough to be a good liar." There was an almost imperceptible pause after the word liar, nothing that Fannie could have identified as deliberate, but she felt it land somewhere between her shoulder blades. She kept her face composed and her hands steady on the invoice she was holding. "That's fortunate for him, then," she said. Claude finished wrapping Seth's goods and pushed the parcel across the counter. Seth paid, tucked the parcel under his arm, and then did not immediately leave. He stood for a moment looking at the stack of invoices Fannie was working through with the curious, assessing look she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "You really do know figures," he said. "I told you I was a bookkeeper," she said. "Most people who tell me things in this town are trying to sell me something," he replied, without rancor. "It's a nice surprise when someone says a thing that turns out to be simply true." He touched his hat to them both and walked out. The bell above the door rang again in his wake, and Fannie stood very still for a moment, looking at the door. Claude chuckled softly behind her. "Seth Ramsey is one of the good ones," the old man said, settling himself back onto his stool behind the opposite counter. "Been riding for the Circular going on 6 years. Honest as the day is long. Tanner, that's the foreman, trusts him with everything." "He seems very direct," Fannie said carefully. "That's a kind way to put it," Claude said, and the affection in his voice was obvious. "He doesn't waste a word, never learned how." Fannie turned back to her invoices and made herself focus on the numbers, which were, unlike almost everything else in her current situation, entirely honest and entirely her own. Seth Ramsey did not leave Caldwell that day, as it turned out. He came back to the store that afternoon with a question about a harness order that Claude had apparently been holding for the circular, and he stayed to drink coffee in the back room while he and Claude worked out the details. Fannie stayed at her counter and worked, but she could hear their voices, Claude's expansive and storyful, Seth's sparse and punctuated by long, thoughtful silences. She heard Seth say at one point, "I don't much care for this town in the evenings when the drives are coming through. Too many men who don't know when to stop drinking." And Claude said, "You could have settled down in a quieter place long ago, Seth. Lord knows you've got the sense for it." And Seth said, with a pause that Fannie imagined was him looking at his coffee cup, "I've been waiting for the right reason." She kept her eyes on her figures and told herself the warm feeling rising in her chest was entirely inappropriate for a woman who was living under a false name. The reason Fannie had never learned to lie particularly well was that her mother had been a woman of fierce honesty, the painful, unsentimental kind that left marks. She had raised Fannie to believe that lies were a particular kind of cowardice, a way of avoiding consequences you deserve to face. Fannie believed this, truly believed it, even now as she was living directly inside one. The discomfort of it sat in her chest like a stone that she carried through every conversation, every smile, every time someone said, "Miss Beaumont," and she looked up and answered. By the third day she was already composing in her head the conversation in which she would tell Claude Hennessy the truth. She would tell him her name was Fannie Wilcox, not Clara Beaumont, that Clara was her cousin and had sent her in her stead, and that the bookkeeping skills were entirely real and entirely her own. She rehearsed the words in the quiet of her small cedar-smelling room at night and thought that Claude, being the good man everyone said he was, might understand, or he might dismiss her on the spot. Either was possible. She had not yet found the courage to do it when the matter was taken out of her hands. It happened on the fourth morning. Seth Ramsey had not left Caldwell after all, because there was a problem with one of the circular horses that the town's one veterinarian was still sorting out, and he was staying at the boarding house 3 doors down from Hennessy's while he waited. Fannie had seen him twice more in those 3 days, both times briefly in the store, and each time she was aware of the same thing. He looked at her like he was reading something, with focused attention and no hurry. On the 4th morning, she was sweeping the front step of the store when Mrs. Aldrich from the telegraph office came by with her basket, and a particular expression on her face that Fannie would later learn was the expression Mrs. Aldrich wore whenever she had information she believed was relevant to someone else's business. "You're Claude Hennessy's new bookkeeper," Mrs. Aldrich said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, ma'am," Fannie said, tightening her grip on the broom. "Clara Beaumont from St. Louis," Mrs. Aldrich said, and the way she said it had a quality like a key turning in a lock. "Yes," Fannie said, one beat too slow. Mrs. Aldrich tilted her head. "I had a message come through the telegraph yesterday evening," she said, "from a Mrs. Holbrook in St. Louis, asking if a Clara Beaumont had arrived safely, as her niece had suffered an accident and sent a substitute." She paused with the patience of a woman who has delivered news for years and knows when to let silence do its work. The name she gave for the substitute was Fannie Wilcox. The broom handle was very solid in Fannie's hands. The morning sun was very bright. Somewhere down the street a rooster was crowing with complete indifference to the situation. "I see," Fannie said. "I don't suppose you're going to tell me Mrs. Holbrook was confused," Mrs. Aldrich said, and there was something almost gentle in her tone, like she was extending mercy by being direct. "No," Fannie said, "I'm not." The door behind her opened and Claude Hennessy came out to see what the morning conversation was about, and in that moment, with the sun on her face and the broom in her hand, and the truth already extracted from her by this brisk and efficient woman, Fannie Wilcox made the decision she should have made on the first day. "Claude," she said, turning to face him. There's something I need to tell you, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it any other way." Claude looked at her with the slow, attentive expression of a man who has lived long enough to know that this particular opening to a conversation means something significant is coming. "I'm not Clara Beaumont," Fannie said. "My name is Fannie Wilcox. Clara is my cousin. She was injured before the stage left and she asked me to come in her place. The bookkeeping skills are mine and they are real. I have done nothing dishonest with your ledgers or your money. But I came here under a false name and I should have told you on the first day, and I am sorry that I did not." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a public street where several people nearby were pretending not to listen. Claude Hennessy looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Mrs. Aldrich, who gave him the small nod of a woman who has confirmed a thing. Then he looked back at Fannie. "You'd better come inside," he said. The conversation in Claude's back room lasted nearly an hour. Fannie told him everything: her real name, her family situation in St. Louis, the cousin with the twisted ankle, the $17 and the curtain fabric reticule, the reason she needed to start over somewhere no one knew her. Claude listened without interruption, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and she could not tell which until the very end, when he sat back in his chair and interlaced his ink-stained fingers and looked at her with an expression she finally recognized as something close to wry sympathy. "Miss Wilcox," he said, "you are either the most honest dishonest person I have ever met or the most dishonest honest one. I haven't decided which." He paused. "Your work on those invoices was the best bookkeeping I've seen in 2 years. The woman before you was legitimately named and thoroughly useless with a ledger." Fannie held very still. "I'm going to need to write to Mrs. Holbrook," Claude said, "and to your cousin, and I am going to have to think carefully about the matter." He looked at her with a directness that was not unkind. "What you did was not right, Miss Wilcox, but I understand why you did it, and I can see what kind of person you are from 3 days of working beside you." He stood and smoothed his vest. "Go back to work. I'll have an answer for you by the end of the day." Fannie went back to her counter. Her hands shook only slightly as she opened the next ledger. She did not see Seth Ramsey until mid-morning, when he came in for a length of rope and found her at the counter with a composure she had worked hard to restore. He looked at her for a moment longer than usual. "You look like a woman who has just done something difficult," he said. "I told the truth about something I should have told the truth about on the first day," she said. She did not know why she told him, except that it seemed dishonest not to, given that he had been the first person she had lied to in this town. His expression did not change much, but she saw something move through his gray-blue eyes' attention, and something warmer. "What was the lie?" he asked. She told him. All of it briefly and plainly, standing behind the counter of a dry goods store with the smell of coffee and tobacco and cedar around them, and the morning light coming through the single window. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He set the rope down on the counter and looked at her with a steadiness that she was beginning to realize was simply how he looked at everything he considered important. "I appreciate honesty," he said. "I appreciate it enough to forgive a lie when I can hear the truth behind it." He said it without drama, the way he said most things, as if it were simply a fact about himself that he was sharing because it seemed relevant. Life pushes people into corners they didn't mean to be in. "I've been in a few of my own." Fannie looked at him, and for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach she felt something loosen in her chest, not entirely, not the whole stone, but enough to breathe properly. "Thank you," she said. "That is more generosity than I expected." "It's not generosity," he said, picking up the rope. "It's just sense." He looked at her for a moment more. "I hope Claude sees it that way too." "He said he'd give me an answer by the end of the day," she said. Seth nodded, paid for the rope, started for the door, paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at her with that same focused, reading expression. "For what it's worth, Miss Wilcox," he said, and she noticed that he had used her real name without being told it, which meant he had been listening very carefully to her story. Caldwell could use a woman with the courage to tell an inconvenient truth. He left. The bell rang. The morning light shifted. Fannie Wilcox stood very still for a moment, her hands flat on the ledger, and thought that Seth Ramsey was the most remarkable man she had encountered in her 22 years on the earth. Claude's answer, delivered that evening over a simple supper of salt pork and cornbread in the back room while the store was shut up for the night, was that she could stay. He would write to Mrs. Holbrook explaining the situation, and he would give Fannie legitimate employment as Fannie Wilcox, bookkeeper, with a fair wage in the room she was already using. "You're honest enough to embarrass most people I know," he told her, "and that is a rarer quality than mathematical skill. You've got both, which makes you about the most useful person I've hired in a decade." Fannie thanked him with more restraint than she felt, because she was still shaking a little from the relief of it. After supper, she sat in her cedar-smelling room and wrote a long letter to her cousin Clara, explaining everything and felt, for the first time since she had left St. Louis, that she was standing on real ground. In the days that followed, Caldwell revealed itself to her in increments. It was a cattle town on the edge of the Cherokee Strip, the last stop before Indian Territory, and it had the character that came with that position. Everything was provisional. Everyone was passing through or preparing to. The long cattle drives were starting again with the warming of the spring, and the main street filled each evening with drovers who had ridden 500 miles from Texas and wanted whiskey and a game of cards. Fannie learned which parts of town to avoid after dark, which merchants were trustworthy, and which would work you a bad deal if you didn't know better, where the good well was and where the water tasted of iron. She also learned that Seth Ramsey was still in Caldwell, not because the horse was still sick, it had recovered, but because the Circular's foreman, a weathered man named Tanner, had asked Seth to stay and coordinate the pickup of a large supply order that Claude was assembling for the ranch. This meant that Seth came into the store most mornings and stayed sometimes for coffee and talked with Claude about cattle and weather and the state of the trails south, and occasionally, with increasing frequency, talked with Fannie about ledgers and figures and the small daily business of the store. She noticed that he was careful with her, not in the way of a man who is uncertain or awkward, but in the way of someone who respects a thing and handles it accordingly. He asked her questions about her work and listened to the answers with actual attention. He did not talk down to her or past her. When she made a comment about the discrepancy she had found in the February accounts, an overcharge from a supplier in Wichita, he looked at the relevant pages with her and confirmed her reading and said flatly, "Claude should have caught that months ago. Good that you did," without any qualifier about it being surprising for a woman to have caught it. She appreciated that more than she could have easily explained. One morning, about 2 weeks after she had arrived, she was outside the store trying to secure a crate that had come loose on a delivery wagon when the rope she was working with got tangled beyond her ability to manage it quickly, and the crate shifted dangerously. Seth, who was crossing the street at that moment, moved without hesitation and was beside her in seconds, his hand steadying the crate while she got the rope sorted. They were very close. Close enough that she could see the darker ring around the gray-blue of his irises and the faint white lines that sun and wind had traced at the corners of his eyes. "Thank you," she said. "You almost had it," he said, not as flattery but as genuine observation. "I did have it wrong," she said. "I should have asked for help from the beginning." He looked at her with that particular attention of his. "There's a difference between asking for help and admitting defeat," he said. "You know the difference." "That's worth something." She tied off the rope. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she was fairly certain it had nothing to do with the crate. That evening, walking back from the well in the long amber light of the Kansas spring dusk, she met Seth on the main street. He fell into step beside her without ceremony, and they walked in companionable silence for a moment before he said, "Have you found it very different from St. Louis?" "Entirely different," she said. "Louder and quieter at the same time. Loud at night and very quiet in the mornings." "The mornings are the best part," he agreed. "You're from Kansas originally?" she asked. "Missouri," he said. "Came out here when I was 20. That's 8 years ago now." She did a brief calculation. He was 28, 6 years older than her. She noted it and filed it without attaching any particular weight to it. "What brought you here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, she had come to understand, but careful with his words. "My father died when I was young. My mother passed when I was 19. I had a younger brother who needed looking after until he was old enough to manage himself. I took whatever work I could find, ended up on the trail drives. Found I was good with horses and cattle and the open country. Found I was less good with closed-in places and settled expectations." A pause. "My brother is settled now up near Abilene, has a wife and a baby coming." Something in his voice warmed perceptibly when he mentioned this. "I visit when I can." "You raised him," Fannie said. "We raised each other," Seth said. "He was always smarter than me. He'd say differently, but he'd be wrong." The store was just ahead of them. Fannie slowed her pace by instinct, not wanting the walk to end. The sun was sitting just above the horizon now, painting the whole flat Kansas sky in shades of copper and rose. "What made you decide to stay in Caldwell after all?" she asked. "I thought you were leaving days ago." He stopped walking. She stopped too. He looked down at her in the last of the evening light with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, more open, less composed. "I'm not entirely sure I can give you an honest answer to that question yet," he said. "When I can, I will." She looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate honesty," she said quietly, deliberately echoing his own words back to him. The corner of his mouth moved. "I know," he said. "Good night, Miss Wilcox." "Good night, Mr. Ramsey." She went inside. She stood in her cedar room for a long time afterward, looking at nothing, with the warmth of the evening and the warmth of that conversation layered together in a way she could not separate. The circular supply order was assembled over the following week, and during that time Seth was in and out of the store daily, sometimes twice. Fannie found herself thinking about the times he would arrive before he arrived, and thinking about them again after he had gone, which she recognized as a specific kind of trouble. He was direct with her always. He told her honestly when he thought her accounting of a particular invoice was wrong. She had miscalculated a freight charge one morning, and when she went back and found that he was correct, she told him so without any embarrassment, and he accepted it with equal simplicity. There was a quality to their exchanges that Fannie had not experienced before in any relationship she could remember, a kind of clean air in the space between them, free of the usual social performances that both people maintained everywhere else. She told him about her father one afternoon, while they were both waiting for Claude to find a misplaced order form, and the silence had stretched itself comfortably enough to be filled. She told him plainly. Her father had been a good man until the drinking started when she was 12, and after that he had been a diminishing one, and she had learned young to do the household accounting and manage what money came in, because someone had to. Seth listened. He did not offer consolation or commentary. When she was done, he said, "That explains the steadiness in you." "What do you mean?" she asked. "You were the steady one in your house when you were young," he said. "You learned to be reliable because no one else was. It's in the way you work. It's in the way you handle things when they go wrong." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said everything. "It's one of the things I noticed about you." She looked at him. "What else did you notice?" she asked, and then felt immediately, acutely self-conscious about the directness of the question. He met her gaze with perfect equanimity. "I'll tell you the rest when the accounting feels more complete," he said, which she was beginning to understand was his particular way of saying things that were not yet ready to be said aloud, and which she found, against all reasonable expectation, more intimate than any amount of easier talk. The supply order was fully assembled on a Thursday. On Friday morning, Seth told Claude he would be leaving Saturday at first light to take the wagon out to the circular, which was a day's ride southeast. Fannie heard this while she was at her counter with her back partially turned, and she kept her face toward the ledger and her pen moving, and did not let herself turn around. That afternoon Seth came to the counter alone, without Claude in earshot, and stood on the other side of the wood with his hat in his hands. "I'd like to come back to Caldwell in a month or so," he said. "When the next supply run comes up, if that would be agreeable to you." She looked at him steadily. "You don't need my agreement to ride to town," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I'd like to have it anyway." The sun through the window was doing something very favorable to his eyes. Fannie was aware of her own pulse in a way she considered inconvenient. "It would be agreeable to me," she said. He nodded. A pause. "In the meantime, if you had anything you wanted to say that didn't belong in a regular letter, you could send it care of the post at the Circle. Our Tanner picks up the mail on Sundays." She looked at him. "What sort of thing would I say that doesn't belong in a regular letter?" she asked. He looked back at her with those careful, attending gray-blue eyes. "Whatever kind of thing you'd want me to know," he said simply. "I'd be interested in it." He came back the next morning just before first light to collect the wagon. The store was not yet open, but Fannie was at her window, which was her habit in the early mornings when the town was quiet and the sky was doing its best work in the east. She saw him cross the street with his long, unhurried stride, check the wagon, speak briefly with the boy Claude employed to help with heavy loads. She watched him climb up onto the wagon seat, take the reins, and look once at the store. She was not sure he could see her through the glass in the early light, but she raised her hand anyway. He touched the brim of his hat. Then he drove south, into the wide Kansas morning, and Fannie stood at her window until the wagon was no more than a moving point in the distance, feeling something large and serious working its way around in her chest like a thing that had finally decided to take up space. She wrote him a letter that evening. It was not a love letter, precisely. It was a careful, somewhat formal account of 3 interesting things she had noticed about Caldwell that day: a particular flower she had seen growing up through the boards of the abandoned building across the street, an argument she had overheard between 2 cattlemen about the relative merits of longhorns versus shorthorns, and a small kindness Claude had done for a woman who came in with not quite enough money for the medicine she needed. She ended it by saying that she found Caldwell less rough than she had expected and more interesting, and that she was glad she had come. She signed it Fannie Wilcox. She mailed it to Seth Ramsey, care of Tanner at the Circle, and then went back to the ledgers with the pleasant, slightly terrifying feeling of having committed herself to something. His letter arrived 11 days later. He was not a natural correspondent. He wrote at the beginning, and she should not expect poetry. What followed was 4 close-written pages that were dense with observation and dry with humor and completely devoid of poetry, as promised, and were also the most interesting thing she had read in months. He wrote about the cattle and the land and the long flat horizons that he had come to believe were the best view in the world. He wrote about a conversation he'd had with one of the younger cowboys, a 19-year-old from Georgia named Holt, who was homesick in a way that Seth found he could not entirely fix, but was trying to address with coffee and practical work assignments. He wrote about his brother's baby, which had been born, a boy, healthy, to his brother's considerable and eloquent joy. He wrote, at the very end, that the yellow flower she had described growing through the boards of the abandoned building was a type of daisy that grew wild on the plains, and that, in his experience, was exactly the kind of flower that could not be discouraged by anything, which he considered a quality worth admiring. Fannie read that last line 3 times. She wrote back. The month stretched into 6 weeks because of a problem with one of the cattle herds that required Seth's attention at a difficult section of terrain near the Oklahoma border. His next letter explained this with characteristic directness and without apology, and there was something underneath the explanation, a current of impatience she could read between the lines, that told her he was not pleased about the delay and was not pleased about it specifically in relation to her. She found that she was not at all displeased to know that. They had been writing for 2 months when he rode back into Caldwell on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, with dust on him, and the particular set of his shoulders that she had already catalogued as his road posture versus his at-rest posture. She was in the store when she heard the bell above the door and looked up, and it was him, and the way that something in her chest immediately reorganized itself told her, with considerable clarity, what she was dealing with. "Mr. Ramsey," she said. "Miss Wilcox," he said, "you look well." "So do you," she said, which was entirely true and also slightly beside the point, since he looked sun-browned and trail-worn and was tracking a modest amount of Kansas into the store on his boots. Claude came out from the back and welcomed him with genuine warmth and the offer of coffee, and Seth accepted both, and the next 2 hours passed in the way of those 2 months of letters, easy and attentive and full of things being said that held other things underneath them that were not quite yet spoken. That evening Seth asked Fannie if she would care to walk with him down by the creek that ran south of the main town, where it was quieter and the evening air was better. She said she would. They walked through the long blue twilight that Kansas summers produce with such generosity, where the sky stays light for what seems like hours past any reasonable expectation of darkness, and the creek made a steady, sensible sound over its stones. "I want to say something plainly," Seth said when they had been walking for a little while. "I would expect nothing less from you," Fannie said. He stopped. She stopped beside him. The creek ran past them. The sky above the plains was an extraordinary gradation of colors, none of which had names precise enough to be useful. "I have thought about you every day since I left," he said. "I would not usually say a thing like that because it is the kind of thing that can embarrass people or be misinterpreted. But you are a woman who values plain speaking, and so I am telling you plainly. I have thought about you every day, and the thinking has been," he paused in his particular way, "considerable." Fannie looked at him. The last of the light was doing excellent things to his face, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was very beautiful in the way that honest, well-made things were beautiful. "I have also thought about you considerably," she said, "every day or very nearly." The quiet that followed was not an uncomfortable one. It was the quiet of two people standing at the edge of something large and taking it seriously. "I don't know what your plans are," Seth said, "for staying in Caldwell or moving on somewhere else eventually. I won't ask you to make decisions about things you haven't thought through, but I want you to know that my interest in you, is not a passing thing. I'm not a passing thing kind of man." "I had gathered that," Fannie said. "Good," he said. "Then we understand each other." "We understand the beginning of each other," she said carefully. "There's more to understand." "Yes," he agreed. "I'd like to do that." She looked at him. "So would I." He reached out and took her hand, the way he had shaken it on that first day, firm and warm, except that this time his fingers curled around hers and stayed. They stood there by the creek in the last of the June light, holding hands with the simplicity of two people who have decided to be honest with each other about what they want. And Fannie thought that this was the best she had felt in all of her 22 years, which was saying something considerable about a woman who had had some good days in her life. They walked back to town in the fading dark with their hands still linked, and when they reached the door of the store Seth let go of her hand slowly with what she recognized as reluctance. "I'll be in town for 3 days," he said. "I'd like to spend some time with you if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. He touched her cheek once very gently with the back of his fingers, barely a touch at all, more like a question, and she leaned toward it very slightly, which was her answer. "Good night, Fannie," he said. It was the first time he had used just her name. She noticed it the way you notice when the wind changes direction. "Good night, Seth," she said. Those 3 days were among the best of Fannie's life up to that point. They had supper together at the boarding house dining room twice, which Claude facilitated with the discreet satisfaction of a man who considers himself a matchmaker, and is right. They walked to the creek again one morning, in the bright cool of the early day, and sat on the bank and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. The direction of their lives, what they wanted from the future, small funny things that had happened in the weeks they'd been apart. Seth had a dry, quiet humor that Fannie found increasingly wonderful, the kind that crept up on you from unexpected directions and then landed precisely. He laughed easily when something actually struck him as funny, and his laugh was low and real, and she wanted to earn it as often as she could. On the third day, in the afternoon, a situation arose in the store that required Fannie's immediate attention. A rancher from outside town came in with a disputed account. He was certain he had paid a bill that Claude's records showed as unpaid, and the disagreement was heading toward unpleasantness when Fannie sat down with both sets of records and worked through them carefully. What she found was that the payment had been received and noted in one ledger but not transferred to the main account, an administrative error that was Claude's doing and that Fannie explained without blame to both men. The rancher's account was cleared. Claude apologized. The rancher, mollified, bought an additional $20 of supplies. Seth had been in the back room during all of this. When the rancher left, he came out to the main floor and looked at Fannie at her counter. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "I handled it accurately," she said. "The beauty is the accuracy." He looked at her with that full attention of his. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly what I mean." She was sure she was flushing. She kept her eyes on the ledger. That evening, before he left the next morning, they sat on the front step of the store in the cooling air while the town did its evening business around them. The piano from the saloon down the street, the laughter and argument of the drovers passing through, the ordinary sounds of a rough town settling into its night. "I'll be back in a month," Seth said. "Maybe sooner. There's a question I've been turning over, and I think by a month's time I'll have thought it through properly." Fannie looked at him. "What sort of question?" she asked, although she thought she knew, and the thought of it made her feel as though she were standing at a very great height with the most extraordinary view she had ever seen. "The important kind," he said. "The kind a man thinks carefully about before he asks it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Take all the time you need," she said. "I will be here." He nodded. He looked at her in the lamplight with an expression that was undone in the way of strong men who allow themselves to feel something strongly, and she thought her heart would simply split from the weight of what she felt for him. He left the next morning. She watched him from the window again. He touched his hat again. The planes opened behind him and swallowed him back into themselves, and she stood at the window for a long time after. The month that followed was full. Caldwell was full. For one thing, the summer drives were in full swing, and the town was busier than she had yet seen it, with cattle herds passing through almost daily, and the business at Hennessy's dry goods as brisk as Claude could manage. Fannie threw herself into the work with an energy that had everything to do with being happy, and happy for reasons that went beyond the job, which made the job better too. She wrote to Seth every week. His letters came reliably, every 10 days or so, and each one was slightly longer than the last, slightly more willing to say things plainly that an earlier version of him might have held back. He told her about Holt, the homesick Georgia boy who had ridden home for a visit and come back looking better. He told her about a night on the plain during a thunderstorm when the cattle had nearly spooked, and he had spent 4 hours in the saddle keeping them calm, and how afterward the whole plain had been washed clean and brilliant, and he had felt, as he sometimes did in the open country, that the world was a good and generous place. He told her that he had been thinking about land, his own land, a section of grassland he had been watching for 3 years that might be coming available south of Caldwell, and whether this was the moment to make an offer. She wrote back about the land. She knew figures and she knew how to read a ledger, and she wrote him a careful letter about what she thought the finances might look like, based on what he had told her about his savings, and what kind of arrangement with a bank or a private buyer might make the purchase workable. He wrote back and said he had read her letter 4 times and that she had done the figures better than he could have himself, and that this was one of many reasons he was looking forward to asking her the question. She sat with that letter in her cedar room for a long time. He came back in August, 6 weeks after he had left, on a day that was bright and hot and smelling of sun-baked grass, and he came with purpose. She could see it in the way he walked across the street toward the store, direct and unhurried and entirely decided. He came in. Claude, with the instinct of a man who reads rooms well, discovered urgent business in the back. Seth stood at the counter across from Fannie, hat in his hands as he had done on that first day. She folded her hands on the ledger and looked at him and waited. "Fannie," he said, "I want to marry you." She let the words land. She had thought about them, had rehearsed some version of this moment for weeks, and still they landed with a weight and a warmth that she had not fully prepared for. "I have been thinking carefully," he continued, because he was Seth and he did not leave the important things halfway said, "about what kind of life I want and what kind of person I want to build it with. I want land of my own and work that matters and a home that is real. And I want you beside me in that life, not as a convenience or a decoration or a habit, because you are the most honest, steady, capable person I have met in 8 years of looking, and I am," a brief pause, a deeper breath, "I am entirely in love with you, Fannie Wilcox, which is a thing I have not said to any woman before and do not say lightly." The morning light was very bright. The smell of cedar and coffee was all around her. Down the street, very distantly, the drovers were moving cattle and the town was making its usual noise. Fannie Wilcox, who had come to Caldwell, Kansas, with $17 and a borrowed name and the desperate hope of a new life, looked at Seth Ramsey, honest, careful, weathered, wonderful Seth Ramsey, and felt the last stone in her chest dissolve entirely. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He came around the counter. She stepped to meet him. He took her face in both his hands and looked at her for one careful, attending moment that felt like the entirety of all the letters and all the walks and all the evenings at the creek and all the mornings at the window compressed into a single luminous point. And then he kissed her, and it was like all the rest of him, direct and warm and entirely genuine. And she put her hands on his chest and kissed him back with everything she had. Claude Hennessy came out from the back room with 3 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who has been right about something for 2 months and is very pleased with himself. "I thought this might be the outcome," he said cheerfully, setting the cups down. "Sit down, both of you. We should talk properly." They sat. They talked. Claude, it turned out, had been aware of the situation between them with the full clarity of a man who has run a store in a small town for 20 years and sees everything that comes through his door. He offered his congratulations with genuine warmth and told them, to Seth's visible gratitude, that he had already been in contact with the owner of the land Seth had been watching, a man named Whitfield, who was indeed considering selling. "You'll want good figures before you approach Whitfield," Claude said, looking at Fannie with his particular warm shrewdness. "Good thing you've got the best bookkeeper in Caldwell already at your disposal." Seth looked at Fannie. "She was the best bookkeeper in this store before she told me her real name," he said. "She's only gotten better since." Fannie laughed, and it was a full, real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and comes out without any management at all. Seth looked at her with an expression that made Claude look quickly at his coffee cup. They were married 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in late September of 1879, in the small white church at the north end of Caldwell's Main Street that served the decent population of the town as well as any visiting preacher who happened through. The day was cool and brilliant, the Kansas sky doing its absolute best work in the clear autumn light, and Fannie wore a dress she and Mrs. Aldrich, who had turned out to be a good friend and an excellent seamstress once you got past the professional habit of information management, had made from blue fabric that Claude insisted on paying for as a wedding gift. Seth stood at the front of that small church in a clean suit that he wore with the careful dignity of a man who does not often wear such things but takes the occasion seriously. And when Fannie walked down the aisle with Claude beside her, who had volunteered for this honor with the proud awkwardness of a fond older man, Seth looked at her with an expression so unguarded and full that the preacher paused a moment in his preamble and smiled. They said their vows in the plain language of the 1879 marriage ceremony, and Seth said his with the particular attention he gave to everything that mattered, clear and direct, and meant entirely. Fannie said hers in a steady voice because she was a steady person, but her hands were trembling very slightly when she took Seth's, and he covered them with both of his, warm and certain. They were married. The small congregation, Claude, Mrs. Aldrich, several of the store's regular customers, Holt the Georgia cowboy who had ridden in from the Circular specifically for the occasion, and a handful of other Caldwell residents who had watched the whole thing unfold over the summer and felt a proprietary interest in the outcome, clapped with genuine enthusiasm. That night they had supper at the boarding house, a long table full of people who had become, in these few months, something like family, and there was laughter and stories and Mrs. Aldrich's dried apple pie and a bottle of good whiskey that Seth produced and poured for everyone, including a small ceremonial measure for Claude, who usually didn't drink but said this was an exception. "To honesty," Seth said, raising his glass with his eyes on Fannie. "To honesty," she echoed, and the whole table echoed them back, and the autumn night outside was wide and dark and full of stars. In the months that followed, they built a life with the same quality that had characterized everything between them from the beginning: direct, attentive, and entirely mutual. Seth completed the purchase of the land from Whitfield, 160 acres of good Kansas grassland, with a payment arrangement that Fannie had structured, and that was fair to both parties. She continued working at Hennessy's while they built their house, because the income was needed, and because she loved the work, and Claude, who was getting older and whose eyes were getting worse, was genuinely dependent on her now. Seth rode between the Circular and the new property, working their land on the days he wasn't needed at the ranch, and slowly, steadily, the shape of their future began to emerge from the flat Kansas plain. The house was a one-room plank structure at first, with a proper door and 2 windows and a good wood stove, which Seth built himself with help from Holt and another Circular hand named Daniels. It was small and unfinished and completely theirs, and the first night they slept in it Fannie lay awake listening to the prairie wind against the planks and the steady sound of Seth's breathing beside her, and thought about Clara Beaumont's twisted ankle and the $17 and the curtain fabric reticule, and the lie she had told when she stepped off the stagecoach, and thought that sometimes the most disastrous beginning is simply the universe pushing you toward the life you were supposed to have. "Are you awake?" Seth said in the dark. "Yes," she said. "What are you thinking?" "That I'm glad Mrs. Aldrich is the kind of woman who reads telegrams," Fannie said. He was quiet for a moment, then he laughed, that low, real laugh she had worked so hard to earn. "I've thought the same thing," he said. He reached for her hand in the dark and held it. "It is a remarkable thing," he said, "to be exactly where you're supposed to be." "I know," she said. "I feel it too." The first Kansas winter was harder than anything Fannie had experienced in St. Louis, which had its cold, but nothing like the particular, relentless cold that rolled down across the plains in December and January, as if the North had decided to settle the matter permanently. The woodpile had to be built higher than either of them had planned, and there were mornings when the world outside the 2 windows was entirely white, and the temperature was something that made the air feel like it had an actual physical quality, a resistance. They managed it together with the competence of 2 people who know how to solve problems. Seth was experienced with the cold in the way of someone who had spent winters on trail drives and open ranges, and Fannie had a gift for provisioning and planning that made the difference between a hard winter and a dangerous one. She kept careful track of their stores, adjusted recipes for what was available, maintained the accounts of both the household and the store with the same focused precision, and never complained about the cold, which Seth noticed and appreciated. He told her so directly, one evening by the stove when the wind outside was doing its worst, and they were warm and close and entirely comfortable. "You never complain," he said. "Complaining doesn't warm the house," she said. "No, but some people do it anyway," he said, "for the relief of it. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Should I complain more?" He looked at her sidelong. "No," he said. "I want exactly what you give me. I'm just telling you I notice it." She looked at him. "I know you notice things," she said. "That is one of my favorite things about you." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the stove clicked and settled, and outside the winter made its sounds, and inside everything was warm and right. Seth's brother James came to visit in February. He was a few years younger than Seth, slender where Seth was broad, with a quick open face, and his wife, a dark-haired woman named Louise, who carried their infant son Marcus on her hip with the practiced ease of a first-time mother who has fully found her footing. The visit lasted 5 days and was one of the best 5 days Fannie had had in a long time. James was, as Seth had said, clearly smarter in certain ways, quicker with words, faster to laugh, more inclined to tell stories at length, and the dynamic between the brothers was the particular one of men who have been through hard things together and come out the other side of them, easy and fond and entirely honest about each other's faults. She heard James tell Seth, without any softening, that his hat was still terrible, and Seth respond without any defense that James had always had terrible opinions about hats, and this exchange seemed to represent years of similar exchanges and was clearly a form of affection. Louise and Fannie found each other with the speed of two women who recognize a kindred soul, and spent most of those 5 days in the easy, full conversation of people who have not had enough good company and are making up for it all at once. Louise had come to Kansas from Ohio as a school teacher and had no illusions about the hardness of it and also no inclination to leave, which Fannie found entirely relatable. On the last evening of the visit, with Marcus asleep in the corner and James and Seth outside checking the horses in the cold, Louise looked at Fannie across the table and said, "He is so happy. I have never seen him like this." Fannie looked at her. "Truly. He was always, I don't know the right word, contained, like he was carrying things he didn't want to trouble anyone with." Louise smiled. "He still carries them, but he carries them differently now, like they don't have to be carried alone." Fannie thought about that for a long time after James and Louise went home. She thought about Seth's containedness, which she knew and recognized the careful silences, the precision of his speech, the way he thought things through completely before he shared them. She had never experienced it as withholding or coldness. She had experienced it as respect, as the seriousness with which he treated things that mattered. But she also heard in Louise's words an invitation to look beneath it more carefully. That evening she asked him directly, because she had learned from him that directness was almost always the better choice, whether there were things he carried that he hadn't yet told her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about the year after his father died, when he was 12 and James was 8, and their mother was trying to hold the farm together and failing. And Seth had done things he wasn't proud of to keep them fed, a couple of thefts that had never been discovered, a deal made with a man whose business was not reputable, and the weight of those years had never fully left him. Fannie listened. She did not flinch or reassure or hurry past it. When he finished, she said, "You were 12, Seth." "I knew it was wrong," he said. 12-year-olds are supposed to know what is wrong," she said. "They are not supposed to be responsible for their family's survival." She looked at him steadily. "You did what you had to do. You also raised a brother who turned out honest and good, and you became the man you are, which is the most honest man I know." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, something held, something released. "You're generous," he said. "No," she said. "I'm accurate. You told me once that the beauty is the accuracy. That applies in both directions." He pulled her toward him and held her for a long time, in the way of a man who rarely allows himself to need comfort and is allowing it now, and she held him back with her whole attention, thinking that of all the things she valued in their life together, this, the ability to hold each other's truths without flinching, was the most valuable thing of all. Spring came back to the plains with the dramatic generosity of a season that has been thoroughly withheld. The grassland turned green in waves, moving from south to north as if the earth were waking up in sections, and the sky above Caldwell went from the flat white of winter to a blue so deep it almost ached. Fannie went back to working the home land with Seth on the days she was not at the store, and found that she loved this too, the physical work of it, the tangible progress of fences going up, and the garden beginning to take shape behind the house, and the first cattle Seth had bought with the savings from his circular wages settling into their new pasture. She was checking the fence line one morning in early April. Seth had asked her to ride the south section while he worked the north, when her horse stopped dead and she saw the problem. A section of fence had come down, and 3 of their cattle had drifted through and were grazing peacefully in the neighboring section, which belonged to a man named Cord Beauchamp. Beauchamp was not a man with whom Seth had good relations. He was an older rancher of the old school, which in 1880 Kansas meant a man who believed in the absolute sovereignty of his own land and the absolute inferiority of anyone who had less of it. And he had made clear in several encounters, since Seth had purchased his land, that he considered a former ranch hand an interloper in the ranks of landowners. Fannie rode toward the cattle, intending to push them back through the gap, and was in the middle of doing so when Beauchamp himself appeared on horseback from the direction of his house, moving fast and looking displeased. "Those are my cattle now," he said flatly, pulling his horse up. "Livestock on my land without permission becomes my livestock. That's the law." Fannie looked at him. He was a big man, red-faced with displeasure and conviction, and she was alone on a horse on the wrong side of a broken fence. She ran a rapid assessment. "Mr. Beauchamp," she said, with the tone she used when sorting out a ledger dispute, calm and precise and entirely unintimidated. "The fence broke last night in the wind. Our cattle drifted through. This is an accident, not a trespass, and I believe you know the difference between the two, being an experienced rancher." She met his eyes. "I'd like to take them back now and patch the fence this afternoon. If there is any damage to your land or your grass, I will note it in Seth and I will make it right." Beauchamp looked at her for a long, calculating moment. "Your husband knows you're out here doing his fence checking?" he asked, and the question was the particular kind that carries a challenge inside it. "My husband asked me to check this section," she said, "because I am entirely capable of doing so, as you can observe." Another moment. Something shifted in Beauchamp's face, not warmth exactly, but a grudging recalibration. "Take your cattle," he said, "and get that fence mended by this afternoon," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Beauchamp." She pushed the cattle back through the gap and rode home with them and went straight to the barn for the fence tools. She had the gap half mended before Seth came back from the north section, and when he saw what she had done and what must have happened, his face went through several expressions in quick succession. "Beauchamp gave you trouble?" he asked. "Not much," she said, handing him the wire stretcher so they could finish together. "He's a man who respects plain speech. I gave him that." Seth looked at her. The spring morning was bright around them, the repaired fence solid between the posts, the cattle peacefully back where they belonged. "I should have checked the south section myself," he said. "I didn't like the idea of you dealing with Beauchamp alone." "I know," she said, "and I appreciate the instinct, but I was there and I handled it and now it's done." He took the wire stretcher and worked for a moment in silence. "You were not frightened?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "But being frightened and being capable are not mutually exclusive." He looked at her again with that look that was becoming familiar to her now, the one that was admiration and love, and something else that she could only call seeing, the sensation of being truly seen by the person whose opinion mattered most. "No," he agreed quietly. "They are not." The summer of 1880 was long and good. The cattle were doing well, the garden was producing more than they could eat, and they were selling the surplus at Hennessy's, and Fannie's work at the store had expanded to include the accounts of 2 other local businesses that Claude had recommended her to. She had become, without particularly planning it, the most trusted bookkeeper in the town of Caldwell, and the work paid enough that she and Seth were able to make their first payment on the land mortgage ahead of schedule, which was a satisfaction so clean and complete that she kept the receipt in her apron pocket for 3 days. It was in this summer that Mrs. Aldrich told Fannie, over tea one afternoon, that she had heard from her sister in Wichita that the railroad was going to come through Caldwell within a few years, which would change everything. Fannie thought about this for several days. She thought about what the railroad meant: more commerce, more people, more business, and with it the inevitable growth of the town beyond its rough cattle drive character. She thought about what Seth had built, the land and the cattle and the work, and whether the changes would threaten it or enhance it. She brought the question to their supper table one evening with the same directness she brought everything. Seth listened carefully. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "The land is good land," he said finally. "The railroad bringing people means the value goes up, not down. If we hold it and work it and add to the herd over the next few years, we'll be in a strong position when it comes." "That's what I thought," she said, "but I wanted to hear your thinking." "You already had it figured," he said, with that slight, specific softening at the corner of his mouth. "I wanted to figure it together," she said. "There's a difference." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Yes," he said, "there is." In November of 1880, Fannie realized she was expecting. She told Seth on a Sunday morning when the light was coming through their 2 windows in long, slanted bars, and the smell of coffee was filling the house, and everything was exactly as it should be. She told him plainly, as she told him everything, and his face did something she had not seen before, something entirely unguarded and radiant, like someone had taken the composed, careful architecture of his expression and simply opened all the doors and windows at once. He stood up from the table and came around to her and held her, not with urgency but with great tenderness, and said, "Thank you," into her hair, which she thought was a very Seth thing to say, precise and true, and not quite the thing someone else would have said, but exactly right for him. She laughed. He pulled back and looked at her. "What?" he said. "Thank you," she repeated. "That's what you say." It seemed accurate, he said, and his eyes were bright, and she loved him so entirely in that moment that she put her face against his shoulder and let herself just feel it. They told Claude that week. He sat back in his chair with the expression of a man receiving the best possible news and said, "Good Lord, finally, more people in this family," which was very Claude and made them both laugh. They told James and Louise by letter. Louise wrote back immediately with advice about ginger tea for the nausea, and a note saying she was already planning to come and visit when the baby arrived. James wrote back a single paragraph in his quick, expressive way that managed to say more in those few lines than most people could in a page, ending with, "You deserve every good thing, Seth. You always have." Fannie kept that letter in the same cedar box where she kept Seth's early letters to the store. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was gentler than the first one, or maybe they were simply better prepared for it, or maybe everything is easier when you are waiting for something wonderful. Fannie worked through the winter months at the store, and at the accounts she kept for the other businesses, finding that the physical work of the desk required no accommodation for some time, and being grateful for the continuity of it. Seth was extra attentive and extra quiet about it in the way she had come to recognize as his form of tenderness. Not hover, not fuss, but a focused, constant awareness. He made sure the woodpile was double what it needed to be. He rearranged the house to make certain parts easier for her to manage. He rode to Wichita himself in January to get the specific supply of medicine the doctor in Caldwell had recommended in weather that was not good, and came back with it and said only that the roads were clear enough. "You did not have to go yourself," she said. "I wanted to make sure it was the right thing," he said. "The pharmacist in Wichita is better than the one here." She looked at him. "Seth Ramsey," she said. "Fannie Ramsey," he replied, which was still a small miracle to her. Her name folded into his in that permanent way. Their son was born in the first week of April, 1881, in the farmhouse on their 160 acres, with the help of Mrs. Aldrich and the town's physician, Dr. Crane. On a morning when the Kansas sky was doing exactly the same brilliant, open-hearted thing it had been doing the first time Fannie had walked toward the main street of Caldwell 2 years before. They named him Daniel, after Seth's father, and he was large and healthy and had Seth's gray-blue eyes and Fannie's dark hair, and a voice that announced itself with impressive conviction from the first moment. Seth held him in the first minutes with the careful, wondering attention he gave to things that were new and important, and looked at Fannie over the small dark head. "He is remarkable," Seth said. "He is very loud," Fannie said, still catching her breath. "Both things," Seth agreed, and she laughed, and he laughed too, and little Daniel, objecting to the vibration, announced himself again. Claude Hennessy came that afternoon and stood in the doorway of the bedroom with his hat in his hands, and looked at Daniel with an expression that was so transparently and completely happy that Fannie thought, not for the first time, that Claude was in some essential way the father she had deserved to have when she was growing up. "He's perfect," Claude said. "He is very opinionated," Fannie said. "Best quality a person can have," Claude said firmly. James and Louise came in May, which was a homecoming of warmth and noise, and the particular joy of two families who are also genuinely fond of each other. Marcus, who was now 18 months and moving with the unstoppable momentum of a toddler who has recently discovered locomotion, took an immediate interest in baby Daniel that required some management. Louise and Fannie sat in the spring light outside the farmhouse with both children between them and talked for hours the way they had at that first visit, except that everything had more layers now, more depth, more of the substance of lived life. James and Seth rode the land together, and when they came back, James stopped in the doorway and looked at his brother with an expression that Fannie caught from across the room. "It's something, isn't it?" James said to Seth. "Not a question." "Yes," Seth said simply. "I remember when we had nothing," James said. Seth nodded. They looked at each other in the particular way of brothers who have shared real hardship, and the look contained everything that was not said, which was considerable. "We have something now," Seth said. "The years moved with the generosity of good years, not without difficulty, because no years are but with the quality of a life being built by two people who are genuinely suited to each other and who know it." The railroad did come to Caldwell in 1880 and building through to 1881, and the change to the town was as significant as Mrs. Aldrich had predicted. The character of Caldwell shifted, still rough at the edges, because cattle towns in Kansas in 1881 did not become genteel overnight, but denser, more commercial, more permanent. New businesses opened. New families arrived. The school that had been a single room in a borrowed building became a proper structure with 2 teachers. Fannie's bookkeeping practice grew with the town. By the time Daniel was old enough to pull himself to standing using the rungs of her chair, she had 6 business accounts besides Claude's, and she had taken on a part-time assistant, a young woman named Nora Dells who had arrived on the stage from Kansas City with the same hungry, starting-over quality that Fannie recognized from her own arrival, and which she was consequently inclined to help. She told Seth about Nora one evening, and he listened, and then said, "You saw yourself in her." "I saw someone who needed a chance," Fannie said. "Same thing," he said gently. And she thought about Clara Beaumont's letter and the $17 and the first lie and Mrs. Aldrich and Seth on the street with his eyes on the disputed horse, and thought that yes, perhaps it was the same thing. Their herd grew through careful management and one good decision after another. Seth knew cattle and land the way Fannie knew figures, and together their combined knowledge made them better at both things than either would have been alone. By 1882, they had expanded to 240 acres, having bought the adjacent section when old Whitfield's other land came available, and the cattle numbered well into the dozens and were turning a consistent profit. Even Cord Beauchamp had come around, in the gradual, reluctant way of a stubborn man who is eventually confronted with evidence he cannot argue with. Seth had helped Beauchamp with a water drainage problem the previous fall that had been threatening one of his best pastures, because it was the right thing to do, and because they were neighbors, and Beauchamp had shaken his hand afterward with the expression of a man who is reconsidering a number of prior assumptions. He was not warm exactly, but he was no longer hostile, and in the economy of men like Beauchamp that represented a significant shift. Claude's eyes got worse through 1881 and into 1882, which was a worry. He was 63 and had been running the store for 30 years and had no family to whom he might hand it, which Fannie knew troubled him in the quiet moments. She discussed it with Seth one evening in the kitchen while Daniel slept and the lamplight was warm around them. He should consider selling, Seth said. To someone who will keep it what it is, Fannie said. He built something honest and useful there. He would hate to see it go over to someone who'd strip the character from it. Seth looked at her, she looked at him. A thought moved between them. We could buy it, he said. Not as a sudden inspiration, but as if he had been moving toward the idea for some time and had just arrived. Fannie was quiet for a moment, running the figures in her head with the automatic speed of a mind that has been working with numbers for 10 years. It would stretch us, she said. But if we financed it correctly and kept the books the way I have them, we could do it. Could we run it alongside the land? Seth asked. You'd run the land, she said. I'd run the store accounts and the bookkeeping practice from the store. Nora could manage the counter. She paused. It would mean you and I would both be working very hard for several years. We already work very hard, he said. Yes, but this would be more. He looked at her with his full, attending gaze. Is it what you want? He asked. I want whatever we build together, she said. But I also think Claude deserves to know that the store goes to someone who values what he built. Then we should talk to him, Seth said, and that was that. The conversation with Claude happened on a Saturday morning, in the back room of the store where Fannie had been working since she arrived, over coffee that Claude had been making in the same pot for as long as she had known him. He listened with the same careful patience he always had, and when they were done, he was quiet for a long time. I've been waiting for someone to say this, he said at last. I didn't know it would be you too. His voice was gruff with something that was not quite composure. I hoped. They worked out the details over the next several months with the painstaking care that characterized everything Seth and Fannie did of significance. A fair price, a payment plan that Fannie structured herself, a transition period during which Claude stayed on part-time as a consultant, and the face of the store while the transfer of ownership became complete. Claude did not retire to nothing. He moved into a comfortable room at the boarding house and spent his mornings helping with the store as long as he was able, which turned out to be for quite some time, because having a purpose was very good for his health. In the late summer of 1882, Fannie discovered she was expecting again. She told Seth on a Sunday morning again, in the same kitchen in the same farmhouse, with the light coming through the same windows, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time. All the doors and windows opened at once. Another one, he said. Another one, she confirmed. Daniel, who was now 15 months and had developed strong opinions about everything, looked up from the floor where he was engaged with a collection of smooth stones that Seth had brought him from the creek, and said something emphatic in the language of 15-month-olds that no one could translate, but everyone agreed seemed appropriate. Their daughter was born in March of 1883. They named her Ruth, after Seth's mother. She was small and precise and watchful from the first hours, with Fannie's dark hair and Seth's expression of intent observation, and she made herself known in the household with a quiet that was more commanding than Daniel's volume. Claude held her on his second day visiting and sat with her for an hour in the armchair by the fire, saying nothing, with the expression of a man who is reviewing the entirety of his life and finding it, in this moment, well spent. Fannie watched him from the kitchen doorway and thought about the letter in her reticule, all those years ago, and how it had led her here. She thought about the lie she had told on that first morning, and the truth she had told that same week, and the man who had said he valued honesty enough to forgive the lie when he could hear the truth behind it. She thought about how that moment, that single exchange at the counter of a dry goods store with the sun on his face and the rope under his arm, had been the pivot on which her entire life had turned. Seth came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, warm and present, the way he always was. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the first day," she said. "About Mrs. Aldrich and the telegraph and the lie I told you." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking in the specific way she had come to know over these years, that deep, attending stillness. "I have thought about that first day too," he said. "I think about how close it was, if you'd held on to the lie. If you hadn't had the courage to tell Claude, a pause, if I hadn't been there when you said your name on the street. If Clara had not twisted her ankle," Fannie said. He laughed low and real. "If Clara had not twisted her ankle," he agreed. He turned her gently to face him. "The world is full of near misses," he said. "I am grateful every day that this was not one of them." She looked at him, at Seth Ramsey, who was 31 years old and had the same gray-blue eyes he had always had and a few more sun lines at the corners, and the same quality of absolute honest attention that had told her, from the very first moment, that this was a man worth telling the truth to. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said back, with the directness of a man who has never once said it without meaning it entirely. In the front room, Daniel had abandoned his stones and was attempting to climb onto Claude's lap to investigate his new sister, and Claude was managing this with the patient diplomacy of a man who has learned, late in life, that a house full of small Ramseys is the best possible version of a life he almost didn't have. Ruth looked up at her approaching brother with Seth's expression of attentive assessment, as if cataloging and considering. The store had been theirs for 6 months now, running well and growing with the town, and the land was producing steadily, and the books were clean and honest, and the house had been extended to accommodate them all with a second room that Seth had built in the fall with the help of Holt, who was still with the Circular and now had a young wife of his own in Georgia he was making plans to bring west. The Kansas sky outside the 2 windows and the 1 new window of the extended room was doing what the Kansas sky always did. That enormous, unbounded thing it did over the plains, as if the world were larger and more possible here than anywhere else. Nora Dells was running the store counter with the competence and growing confidence of a woman who had been given a real chance and was making excellent use of it. She had, in the past year, begun keeping the accounts of 2 additional small businesses herself, under Fannie's supervision, and was saving money with an intentionality that Fannie recognized and encouraged. She had also been seen in conversation with the new schoolteacher, a young man named Mr. Abbott, with a frequency that Claude, now largely retired to the armchair position but still entirely observant, found very satisfying. "History repeats itself," Claude said one afternoon, watching Nora and Mr. Abbott have an earnest conversation about something through the store window. "One hopes," Fannie said from her desk, not looking up. "It does," Claude said with certainty. "In this store, at least, the place seems to produce love affairs." "It produces honesty," Fannie said. "Love affairs are a natural consequence." Claude laughed, and Seth, coming in from outside with Daniel on his shoulder, caught the end of it and raised an eyebrow at Fannie, who smiled at him with the particular smile that meant she would tell him later. He smiled back. The afternoon light came through the store windows and lay across the shelves and the counter and the desk and the faces of the people in the room, and the smell of cedar and coffee and Kansas dust was all around them, and everything was exactly, entirely, and honestly as it should be. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, kept changing, as towns do, and the world kept turning with its usual indifference to individual lives. But on the 160 acres, 240 acres now southeast of the main street, in the house that had grown from 1 room to 3 and would likely need to grow again, in the store that smelled of cedar and kept honest books, In all the daily work and daily conversation and daily choosing of two people who had found each other by way of a lie and a truth and a rope purchase and a walk by a creek, life was good. It was honest and full and growing, and it was built on something solid. Fannie Wilcox Ramsey was 26 years old, and she had a husband who said what he meant and meant what he said, and two children who had their father's eyes and their mother's capacity for useful stubbornness, and a business and a home and a life that were entirely, genuinely, blessedly her own. She had arrived in Caldwell with $17 and a borrowed name and a stone of anxiety in her chest. The stone was gone. In its place was something she had not known to want before she knew it was possible, a life in which she was exactly, entirely herself. Fannie Wilcox, bookkeeper, rancher's wife, mother, keeper of honest accounts, woman who told the truth when it mattered, loved by a man who appreciated honesty enough to forgive a lie, and who had given her, in forgiving it, the truest and best version of her own life. The wind moved across the Kansas grassland. The cattle stood in the afternoon sun. The child slept. The ledger was balanced. The man she loved came in through the door with the evening behind him and looked at her the way he always had, with full, attending honesty, and everything was well, and everything was whole, and there was nothing left in the story that was not known and loved and settled, and it was entirely, perfectly enough.